Okay, well, welcome everyone to our second Rodney seminar for the spring semester. It's a great pleasure to welcome Les Kaufman here. He is a professor of biology at BU. He received his PhD in theoretical ecology and evolutionary biology from Johns Hopkins University. And his lab here at BU is devoted to understanding the processes that create, maintain, extinguish, and conserve aquatic biodiversity. His lab's work encompasses marine, freshwater, and watershed ecosystems in temperate and tropical environments. And collectively, they're engaged in aquatic conservation policy, both in the US and abroad. Those of you who are here these past few minutes heard a little bit about that. One thread of his work is in the study of degradation and regenerative processes on coral reefs, including work in Brazil, Belize, and Florida. And the other major thread addresses coupled human natural systems, or CHANS, correct me if I'm mispronouncing that, exploring the scientific basis for sustainable economies and people-inhabited ecosystems. This interdisciplinary approach involves BU's Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future and involves studies in coastal Massachusetts, the Mekong Basin in Cambodia, Florida, and the Caribbean, and most relevance for us today, the Nile Valley and Great Lakes region of East Africa, with a focus on Lake Victoria. So if you haven't joined us before, we'll let Les share his work with us for a bit, and then at the end we will round out our gathering here with a Q&A. You can either submit questions, you can type questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, or when we get to the Q&A section, you can click the raise hand button, and we'll be able to call on you so that you can unmute yourself and we can have an oral conversation. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Les.
Eric, thank you very much and welcome everybody. I can't see you at the moment, but I presume somebody is out there. If you have any questions, write them, Eric, in the Q&A or the chat.
Either one, whichever you feel comfortable with.
Okay.
The Q&A is easier for us to manage.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'm Les Kaufman. I'm a professor in the biology department and the Pardee Center here at BU. And what I want to talk about today is water in East Africa. All human existence evolves out of the availability and quality of water. And of late, funding agencies have taken to refer to the nexus of all water-related issues as the food, energy, water system. Of course, food and energy are largely coming from water as well, and what we do with the water. In East Africa, we have some additional concerns because East Africa is subject to profound climate change impacts, which we're experiencing now. And it's also one of the great seats of biodiversity in the world, particularly aquatic, freshwater biodiversity. And so for the last 34 years or so, I've been working in East Africa or on East Africa, looking at some of the lakes, particularly in the north, in the Nilotic Valley, Nilotic system, and the relationship between the natural system and the human economy. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. This picture by Chris Augusta was developed for an exhibit at the New England Aquarium, and it's an artist's rendering of just a few of the 600 or so species of small fishes called cichlids that had inhabited Lake Victoria prior to mass extinction. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The East African lakes owe their existence to tectonic upheaval in East Africa and very bad plumbing. There is a certain degree of connectivity among them. The long skinny lakes that you see here are rift lakes. And those were the result of the earth opening up along the East African rift suture lines, and then the holes filling with water. So these are very, very deep and often very old lakes. Lake Victoria is basically the puddle that you see at the street corner when the sewer backs up, because to the left side, to the west of the western arm of the rift, which you see here, like Albert, Edward, Kivu, Tanganyika, are the Ruwenzori Mountains. And this uplifting reversed the flow of the headwaters of the Congo River and several other rivers in East Africa and sent them spilling to the Indian Ocean instead of the Atlantic Ocean. depressions like Lake Victoria Basin filled with water, and that became Lake Victoria. So there are two kinds of lakes here, rift lakes and, I don't know, street corner puddles. This is an outlining of the rift system, and rift systems generally have three arms, and very frequently two of the arms are actively rifting more than the third arm, which tends to get infilled, and geologists refer to that infilled chasm as an holocogen. So if you look here, lakes Malawi, Rukwa, Tanganyika, Kivu. Rukwa's actually doesn't count. Don't look at it. Kivu, Edward, Albert, that's the southern and western rift, and the eastern rift is mostly a small chain of saline lakes, but also includes Lake Turkana, the largest desert lake in the world. Now, each of these lakes has a parent river or river system, the lake being water that's filled a chasm or as a result of uplifting and backing up of a river. Lake Victoria is the legendary source of the Nile. The real source of the Nile is up in Rwanda and Burundi, because that's where the genuine headwaters are. But all of these lakes are part of that same region and parent river system. But as you see, some of them are rift lakes and some of them are backfilled. Some of the rivers in East Africa are endorheic. That means that they don't flow to the sea. And the Omo Gibe River, which we'll talk about a lot with respect to Lake Turkana, is one example of that. But if it weren't in the middle of a desert, it would probably be hooked up to the Nile system. The Shire Zambezi spawned Lake Malawi, and the associated small lakes, Malambi and Chowe, both of the latter two tend to dry up and rehydrate occasionally. And the Congo Basin claims Lake Tanganyika, Kivu, and Mweru. And this business of lakes drying up and rehydrating is a very important part of the dynamic in tropical lakes around the world. People have had a long history with these lakes, as long as you can imagine, in East Africa, with the most recent settlement being Iron Age, about 8,000 years ago, when the region was densely inhabited, relatively densely inhabited by Nilotic peoples coming in from the south, and some Bantu from the west, coming in from the north, and some Bantu from the south and the west. And so people have livelihoods and ways of life that are closely related to the lakes. As many of you know, livelihoods in East Africa are traditionally sort of dichotomous. You're either a nomadic herder or a farmer, and the farmers often, if they're near the lake, will traditionally eat fish, but the herders generally shun them. And that whole system has been all mixed up now by trade and by political strife. So that in places like Lake Turkana, people who never used to really eat a lot of fish now do. So there's high dependence on fish for protein. And this is a happy fish person with catch from Lake Turkana. For energy, this is the Nalubali Dam on the Nile River at Lake Victoria. This is the beginning of the Victoria Nile. And of course, water is critical for drinking and for agriculture. Here we see the expansion of the Ahero rice scheme in Kenya near the town of Kisumu. Now, the fish faunas of these lakes, many of them, not all, are phenomenally diverse. This is just a few of the food and aquarium fishes from Lake Victoria, and you can see carps, and this is an electric fish, elephant nose fish, tetras, little minnows, cichlids, catfish, big catfish, lungfish, and this is the fish that fed East Africa through about 1925. This is the ngege, a type of tilapia that was thought, or was for 30 or 35 years, we couldn't find it anymore in Lake Victoria, even though it was the major source of protein in colonial times and pre-colonial times. This fish has just been reported again from South Kenyan waters in the main lake, and we're going there to study it. Of course, fishes aren't the only phenomenal wildlife in East Africa. Much better known are things like hippos and whale-headed storks and Sitatunga antelope. And I don't know if you're into birds, but this is a swamp gonolek, which is one of the primo birds of East Africa. So people will spend thousands of dollars, affluent people, to see a swamp gonolek. The other amazing thing about several of these lakes is that the same group of fishes, called cichlids, have undergone evolutionary radiations, generating hundreds or up to 1,000 species that live only in any one lake. And the course of this evolution has been parallel. So the same ecological types tend to evolve in all of these places. So looking at these pictures, we can see in Lake Victoria a territorial fish that eats plankton and a midwater fish that eats plankton. The midwater fish is more streamlined, and this forms huge schools, and these guys battle over little turfs on the rocks. Here in Lake Tanganyika, Cyprichromis is the cichlid herring, if you will, and Neolamprologus pulcher, or the daffodil or princess of Burundi, is the territory holding zooplankton eater. In Lake Malawi, we have a midwater plankton eater and a territorial plankton eater. And all of these mirror, in many respects, the evolution of fishes and other animals on coral reefs around the world. And the reason for it is simple: clear water, selection for bright colors as a major mode of communication, and the evolution of forms adapted more to living on the reef or on the bottom, and forms adapted to swimming in midwater and feeding on plankton. The difference is that in Lake Tanganyika over here, that lake is 12 to 15 million years old. The organisms are so derived, in other words, so highly evolved, that for a while, the only way scientists could explain the abundance of seashells, lake shells in Lake Tanganyika with all this ornamentation and all these wild fishes, they thought Lake Tanganyika was actually an arm of the ocean, and it got cut off. And that's where all these marine looking things came from. That's not the case, but it drives home the power of evolutionary convergence. Lake Victoria, on the other hand, is a very, very young system. And despite the fact that it had until recently about 500 or 600 species that only live there of fishes, the lake basin was dry. 12,000 to 14,000 years ago, there were lions running around in the bottom of the lake. So where did all these species come from so quickly? That's a longer story. You're not going to hear that whole story today. Email me. Now, our lab has been involved in work in East Africa since around 1987, when I established a captive breeding program as a conservation measure, kind of an ill-advised one, for the rapidly disappearing fishes of Lake Victoria. And then in '89 was my first trip to Africa, and through a series of unfortunate events, I became head of the Lake Victoria research team, and led an international group to resurrect research on the lake in the wake of the reign of Idi Amin, and kind of reawaken the world to what was going on in this system. During the early '90s, I headed off to a tent in Western Uganda and worked at the Makerere University field station in the Kabale Forest. And colleagues and I from McGill University began the Kabale Forest Dynamics studies, which are closely related to the much older studies begun by Richard Wrangham on chimpanzees. And we had a project called Fish and Chimps. And we'd spend the morning chasing the chimps, and the midday hiking into remote lakes to look at fish. And then in the afternoon, we'd look at trees. Anyway, over the ensuing years, there have been cohorts of students and move in to study Lake Geoga and just generally wandering around the area, working kind of like the water. And what we learned is this: the Great Lakes region, in particular the area where we were working, is facing enormous ecological challenges and consequently challenges for human well-being in addition. All of these things are going on at once. They're closely interrelated, and they create kind of a rat's nest of very hard problems. And until recently, people have been trying to go after these problems one at a time, failing to appreciate that they're really all the same problem. And it's this nexus of climate change, development, very unequal development, inequitable development, and our attempts to sort out the distribution of wealth. So in order to foster development, hydroelectric dams have been built, water has been diverted for agriculture. This, of course, has an impact. It involves a trade-off with the production of protein through wild capture fisheries. Those fisheries have been hard pressed with massive increases in population. They're now overfished. Exotic species have been introduced, further perturbing the system. The buildup of human population has created heavily polluted areas in several of the lakes. Climate change has changed the availability of water. All of this has precipitated mass extinction. Reduction in the food supply, changes in land tenure systems have generated intense political strife, increased the divide even more between rich and poor, which further aggravates the politics. And now, most recently, the world has been made aware of what has always been a problem: the emergence of zoonotic or animal origin pathogens due to incursions into tropical forest and other wild areas. Of course, COVID-19 is only one. That one probably came out of Asia, but Zika is a very famous pathogen from a small forest patch in Uganda. And you've also heard of West Nile virus, and there's a host of others. About 2 or 3 potentially pandemic viruses alone emerge from tropical forest every year and make it into the human population. In Africa, a lot of these challenges really revolve around fresh water. They're very closely interrelated. And I'm going to talk briefly about 3 vignettes. One about the Gibe 3 Dam and Lake Turkana. One about lake level fluctuations and productivity, ecosystem services as dependent on lake dynamics, generally, from a study comparing 15 lakes in Africa. And then finally, a little bit of a focus on my sort of home in Africa, Lake Victoria. Lake Turkana, or the Jade Lake, is very well known as the largest desert lake in the world. It is a saline lake. And over a period of years, I engaged in studies of this lake with colleagues from East Africa and Stony Brook University. And most of the work I'll describe in the next few minutes was carried out by the then graduate students, Natasha Gonaris from Stony Brook and William Ojwang from my lab here at BU. William, at the time of this work, had completed his PhD and was a fishery research officer for Kenya Marine Fishery Research Institute, and then, as now, a scientist with the World Wildlife Fund. Turkana is a magnet for tourists, or was when there were tourists, because of its fascinating culture, its stark scenery, and these guys. There were a lot of crocodiles. I don't know how many of you have read Peter Beard's book, The Eyelids of Morning. Peter Beard and his science colleague, who were sent to the lake ostensibly to study Nile crocodiles, but then later discovered that their instructions were to murder every last one under the guise of scientific research. It's a very, very creepy and marvelously illustrated book. Anyway, here's Tasha with some of her friends uh, uh, near Sibeloy on the east shore of Lake Turkana. Our work was mostly here at Sibeloy, over here at Ferguson Gulf. The most interesting part of the lake is the Omo Delta up here, but as will become apparent in a moment, that's an area of intense political strife. It was too dangerous to send Tasha or really anybody up there. Uh, Lake Turkana has made it into the news for several reasons. One, its obvious response to climate change, which has included, due to our cluster of climate-related effects, the extension of the Omo Delta into the lake. This is 1973. This is today. Well, almost today. It's about 10 years ago, actually. But you can see how rapidly the lake itself is changing. We accelerated that process by putting up a series of dams in Ethiopia. The Omo River is an endorheic river. In other words, it leads only to Lake Turkana and not to the ocean. And a series of dams have been built by Ethiopia, Gibe 1, 2, and 3. 2 more, 4 and 5 are in process. And the net result of this and its impact on Lake Turkana is what we were studying. The water from the dams is generating electricity, and much of it is going to an agricultural scheme for sugar, mostly sugar and cotton. The dams, however, are going to, while storing water, also reduce immediate water availability to the crops, except through irrigation, and of course, cutting off the water supply to Lake Turkana. And the question was, what will happen? We're not the only ones to have wondered about this. The dam you probably heard more about is the Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile, which is located here. In fact, it's drawn so much attention that Omo isn't even on this map. But here is a look at the Omo or Gibe River. Omo in Kenya, Gibe in most of Ethiopia. And as mentioned, these mainstream dams have been put here, generating this enormous reservoir and causing a reduction in the water supply to Lake Turkana. And this is a projection. Someone else did this simulation, but ours came out basically the same. We're anticipating a 40-meter drop in lake level in Lake Turkana by the year 2100. The breaking of the lake into 2 sub-lakes, both hypersaline. They'll both be very, very salty. And the question was, what will happen to the protein source? What will happen to the fish? So we sent Tasha and the Kemfrey team out there. They collected samples using gill nets between 2008 and 2012. We had 6 study sites. And Tasha, very enterprising, got tissues for us to analyze the food web, the feeding relationships of these fishes using a method called stable isotopes that I'll explain in a moment. And we focused on just a few species of fishes that were very important either economically or for food, and ecologically because they were part of sort of the working guts of the lake. And we tried to distribute the study species so that it encompassed most of the feeding types or ecological types. We call them trophic guilds of fishes in the lake. Now, the world is full of elements, and these elements exist in multiple forms called isotopes. And isotopes differ if you think of the structure of an atom with protons and neutrons in the nucleus and electrons around it. Isotopes are atoms of the same element that differ in the number of neutrons. Now, if they have many more neutrons or it's a very large nucleus, it'll be unstable and it'll emit particles and energy as radiation. But there's another type of isotope called a stable isotope that is, well, stable and is not emitting radiation, but the atoms still vary in their mass. Now, because of the way enzymatic systems work, enzymes tend to select incidentally for the heavy isotopes of any element. That way, because carbon and nitrogen are two of the important elements in metabolism and nutrition, we can actually look at where an organism was in the food web by looking at the degree to which heavy nitrogen is enriched in their tissues. So an animal up here in the food web has gone through multiple cycles of enrichment, multiple trophic levels in the food chain. They'll have heavy nitrogen predominantly and a lower ratio of heavy nitrogen in an animal that feeds lower in the food web. So this blue square is the tiger fish, this guy. As you can guess, this thing does not eat grass. Look at those teeth. Whereas down here is a type of tilapia called Oreochromis Nile tilapia that eats tiny plankton, and its nitrogen is much lower in enrichment of the heavy isotope. Carbon tells a different story. There is a little bit of enrichment, get heavier carbon relative to the carbon in the atmosphere with trophic levels, but much more importantly, the preponderance of heavy carbon is a function of the habitat where the prey came from that the fish was eating. And we can look at this way. This is a depiction for each species, each color and symbol, of the full range of types of prey as evidenced by their isotopic signatures that were eaten by that fish. And these are the 7 species that we were focused on. Another way of looking at it is statistically, and we ask questions like, how similar are these fishes in where they're eating and what they're eating? How much overlap is there? How flexible are they? How big is one of these ellipses? How many different kinds of food or how many different points in the food web can they find prey and survive? And you see that some of these ellipses are small, like this purple one, the tilapia, and here's its niche area. And some of them are very big, like this Nile perch. Here's this niche area. Now, the Nile perch actually feeds exclusively by engulfing soft prey, but it can feed at any level of the food web. So it gives it a very wide trophic niche. Now, putting these data through models, population models, and lake level models, we're able to infer or predict what kinds of fish are likely to survive in the new Lake Turkana and which ones are likely to disappear. Now, the ones most likely to survive are the Nile tilapia, the Nile perch, and this catfish, Synodontis schall. The ones likely to disappear are this very large tetra, which is a prize game and food fish, the tigerfish, which supports, on a hair trigger here, the tigerfish, which supports a major sport fish industry, labio, and this tilapia. And these are just representative. So what we basically found out is that the new Lake Turkana is likely to be reduced to a low diversity system of species that are still of high value for food, but the productivity of the lake is also going to go down. There will be a protein shortage. So the fluctuations that we saw in Lake Turkana and the fluctuations to come made us wonder more broadly about how fluctuating lake levels can influence things of importance to people: food supply, water supply, obviously, and also the ability of the lake ecosystem to survive. So we looked at 15 lakes in Africa, and we took on board a colleague, Yepik Holding, who's well known in the FAO world, the fish and agriculture world, who had been interested in thinking about these things. we teamed up and we asked, how much does lake level fluctuate in East African lakes? And how important is this to the supply of protein in particular? How is this going to be influenced with climate change and with the construction of hydroelectric dams? What we really wanted to do is quantify the trade-off between energy production and food production, with food subdivided into carbohydrates and protein. In other words, agricultural crops and protein from fish. Humans are obviously impacting water level fluctuation, both through dam construction and water diversion and through climate change. But each lake has an annual signature of seasonal change in lake level, like this one shown here, with a high in the rainy season and a low in the dry season. Actually, this is probably the curve for Lake Turkana, not the other lakes. But there's also year-to-year variation, and we took that into account as well. It's important to remember that at least a third of the total fish landings in Africa are from inland fisheries, and how much we have from year to year is going to be driven by lake level fluctuation. So the question is, what role does this play in structuring the food webs, the ecosystems, and the supply of protein? So for a moment, back to Lake Turkana. This is what the surrounding landscape looks like. It is pretty austere. The lake itself, from fluctuating up and down over millennia, it is a very salty lake. It's freshwater, but highly saline for a freshwater lake. The amazing thing to me is that people have survived there for millennia. These are incredibly tough folk. They are mostly pastoralists, although, as I mentioned earlier, more recently, some have come to work in fish factories and as fishermen, largely driven out of their pastoral way of life by political tensions, especially in and around the Omo Delta. We frequently think of the people here as being the Turkana, but there are actually about half a dozen pretty distinct peoples with a history of trade and also war. Now, the lake's been full of fish for a long time, but again, this wasn't something people paid a huge amount of attention to, except for very few people, until fairly recently, when climate change and war have driven people to seek alternative sources of protein, and a major fishery developed on the lake. That was part of the reason why the government, well, originally British colonial rule, was interested in getting rid of the crocodiles. One of the lake's most productive areas is a place on the west coast called Ferguson Gulf. It's a pretty small area. As you can see, this is an arid landscape. This is a wadi that used to flow into the lake. This area is called Ferguson's Gulf. It's shallow. And this is an engine for producing Nile tilapia, which is the most popular food fish out of Lake Turkana. Nile perch, of course, are also taken, but they're a little more difficult to handle in a tropical environment with little electricity because they're very, very fatty and they spoil rapidly. These two red circles indicate former fish factories, each of which used to be on the lakeshore. Now, this is what Ferguson Gulf looked like in 2009. And this is 2012. Now, this isn't the first time Ferguson Gulf started drying up. I mean, you can see old lake level stands as far back as here near this fish plant, which doesn't work anymore. And of course, this means the lake is more saline, less suitable for tilapia, A lot of breeding areas are now high and dry. It's not good for the fishery. It goes both ways. When lakes fluctuate up and down, these are pictures of the catastrophic flooding that we experienced in Kusumu and other places around the shore of Lake Victoria in the last few years. This is actually downtown Kisumu near Dunga, it looks like. And this is that same rice scheme that I showed you earlier, the Ahero rice scheme. And you could see that this was not good for the rice. Rice likes water, but there's a limit. So this was a major, major crop failure for the rice crop in Kenya that year. And that was the least of it. Imagine trying to deal with this. It's Katrina style, Katrina class flooding. So obviously lake level fluctuation matters. So we began to take a look at it in these 15 lakes. And we chose these 15 lakes for two reasons. One, there was a lot of data available. Two, a model called Ecopath, developed by a colleague at the University of British Columbia, is widely used for fisheries management. And because people had created Ecopath models for all of these lakes, in some cases several, we had populated models with vetted data that we could use for our different analysis. And what we were doing is calculating something called relative lake level fluctuation, which takes into account the mean lake level amplitude. That means over decades, how much has this lake gone up and down? And how does that relate to the depth of the lake? And then we multiply by 100 to get a nice sized number. And this seems to capture just about everything about lake level fluctuation. And this was originally published by Jeppe and our colleague Paul van Swieten in 2012. I have a large group of colleagues stationed in the Netherlands. They've been leaders in limnological research for a very long time. And I was trained in the taxonomy of the fish of Lake Victoria by my Dutch colleagues, who then were at the University of Leiden. Anyway, RLLF, this is our kind of magic index. And we predicted that this index of fluctuation will be negatively correlated with the maturity of the system. In other words, its stability, its food web dynamics, and its biodiversity. And we examined these data with a variety of tools, particularly principal component analysis. Remember, a lot of these data on lake level come from orbital assets and also from tide gauges. And just for comparison, this is Lake Tanganyika. Look at its RLLF annual, which is 0.04. Even its seasonal fluctuation is very, very tiny, 0.13, compared to Lake Nakuru, a fluctuating saline lake in the Eastern Rift, with an annual fluctuation index of 19 and a seasonal fluctuation index of 33. Those fluctuations support a massive population of flamingos. Part of the pink that you see here is the color of the salt, but all these little tiny pink dots, every one of those is a flamingo, incredibly. It's quite the sight. If you go there, they'll watch out for the baboons, they steal food. Okay, looking at the relationship between annual and seasonal fluctuation, you of course expect some kind of a correlation, but more interestingly, you can use this graph to find outliers. So Lake Chad has relatively little annual fluctuation and huge seasonal fluctuation. Of course, more recently that's changed. Lake Chad has almost disappeared a few times in recent years. Here's Lake Nakuru, which is very high in both annual and seasonal fluctuation. Often the flamingos in Nakuru need to migrate to Lake Naivasha, which, as you can see, is a little more modest in its fluctuations. They go back and forth between Nakuru, Naivasha, and Elementaita. Now, whoops. This is looking closer to the axis in the origin in this little yellow box. Most of the real action is among the lakes that are a little more subtle in their fluctuation. So most of the big lakes fall here, and you can see that Tana is kind of like a hero of seasonal fluctuation. Tana is under duress now. That's a whole other conversation. And here's where Turkana falls. This is Koroba, which is a reservoir lake behind a hydroelectric dam. Yield is correlated with this fluctuation, which may seem counterintuitive, and so is fishing effort. It doesn't look like that strong a correlation. I'm sorry, the stats vanished here, but it's significant, highly significant, with a pretty high R squared in the 0.4s. So basically, here's this irony. The more the lakes fluctuate, the better it is for fish productivity up to a point. So let's look at primary production, the production of algae that go into the food web. Very similar picture. There is a correlation, but most of the action is down here near the origin. And when we expand that out, we can see that in that early part of the curve, the correlation between productivity annually, between annual fluctuation and productivity is very, very high. So if we look at this and considering all of the input parameters we had available, we ran a principal components analysis, and the first three contributed 80% of the variance, so we focused on those. The first principal component captured yellow is negative correlation, blue is positive. The first one mostly had to deal with the stability of the lake overall. So it's negatively correlated to annual fluctuation, positively correlated to the depth of the lake, how much water is in it, and how long the water remains, which is almost, circular reasoning. It's saying the lake is stable. The second principal component pulled out those lakes that were more of a pulse flow system. So it's positively correlated to this fluctuation index and strongly negatively correlated to the overall catchment area. The third principal component was zeroing in on lakes that are closest to the equator and biggest in catchment area. So this is a special kind of lake. Principal component 2 was basically talking about Lake Turkana. That was a star on that component. Principal component 3 is talking about Lake Nakuru. So when you look at this, you back up and like from 30,000 feet, you look at it, you can see that we're really talking about two kinds of systems at the extremes. Relatively stable systems like the true rift lakes, which have relatively low productivity, clear water, extremely high species diversity, communities revolving around competition and predation. These are highly vulnerable to disturbance. At the other end are extremely high productivity systems that are low in diversity. They tend to have small fish with short lives. That's what R selected means. And they tend to be more resilient, which is counterintuitive. These are the things fluctuating, but in their ability to fluctuate, they're actually quite resilient. These systems are highly vulnerable. This is where the mass extinctions are occurring. These systems are highly resilient, but they put an onus on the human communities to be highly adaptable and nimble because the system is changing so much from year to year. So to summarize this part of our exploration, these simple indices actually ordinate lakes in a very meaningful way and explain a huge amount about their ecological attributes. Of course, it's not the index explaining it, it's the behavior of the lake. What this has given us is kind of a Rosetta Stone to lake dynamics so that we can match economies and livelihoods appropriately to the dynamics of the lake that we're concerned about. Now, there's no lake more famous for anthropogenic impact in the world, probably, except maybe for the Aral Sea, than Lake Victoria. This is Lake Victoria from the air, as I've seen it probably too many times. Let's see, this is Speak Gulf, for those of you who work in Tanzania. This is Mwanza down here. This is Mwanza Gulf, more like Mwanza Drowned River Valley. This is Pasha, Weenam Gulf in Kenya. You see how eutrophic it is. It's very green. Uganda is under the cloud. Up here is Lake Kyoga, a vast swamp system 30 meters lower than Lake Victoria on the Victoria Nile. And here is the Western Rift. And we can see Lake Albert, Edward George, and Lake Kivu. It's an astounding photograph. This is actually from space. The Lake Victoria Basin is vast. It covers 5 countries because in addition to Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, on the lakeshore are Rwanda and Burundi. And this is a depiction of population density around the basin, although this is from some years ago. This again is Lake Kyoga. We'll be coming back to that. Kyoga, Albert, Edward, George, Kivu, Victoria, and the Eastern Rift. If you look over the years, and particularly if you look in French, you can see that the population of Lake Victoria right around the lake has skyrocketed. And a large part of the reason for this was the introduction and explosion of Nile perch, generating a mistaken impression that Lake Victoria was, the California of East Africa, and there was a gold rush for jobs. Unfortunately, the jobs mostly did not materialize, and this led to enormous problems and coincided with the outbreak of AIDS, HIV/AIDS, and all kinds of ills came out of this unplanned massive buildup of population from a few million in 1960 to actually in 2021, I think we're talking 40 million people. This metamorphosis in the region was immense. On the one hand, we have $200 to $300 million a year for many years in foreign revenue from Nile perch exports. On the other hand, a mass extinction, a drop in water quality, widespread malnutrition right next to this huge source of protein. Prostitution exploded in association with the fish value chain. Talk about that in a minute. More waterborne disease, an explosion of HIV/AIDS related to prostitution. This is crazy, but the fish that did succeed in Lake Victoria became the food of choice for the Lord's Resistance Army and several other insurgent groups in Uganda and Congo. This Nile perch also helped fuel the import of arms for wars throughout Central and West Africa, and the industrialized fishery increased income inequality. The lake itself just went haywire. There was an explosion of a tiny prawn called caridina, which became the main food source of Nile perch. Lots and lots of exotic species. Here's James Maikweki of the National Museum holding several of them. And annual emergences of lake flies became spread throughout the year. An enormous amount of the excess productivity went into either the prawns or the flies. Now, the lake had been occupied by this phenomenally diverse assemblage of cichlids, many of them attractive aquarium fish, It became a real craze in the aquarium hobby. My colleague Ole Seehausen wrote a book, now unfortunately out of print. It was snapped up immediately. And today there are several thousand people around the world who are totally obsessed with these fish and hang on every research report that we generate from the field. The other thing that happened was the massive eruption of the Nile perch population, which came to constitute 80% of the biomass in the lake, where previously that biomass had been in these small cichlid fishes. There were also, due to the increased nutrient levels in the water, explosions of exotic floating plants, exotic and native. These are islands of water hyacinth in Weanham Gulf. The town of Kisumu is here. And here's a blue heron. Well, actually, it's an African gray heron trying to figure out where it's going to go fishing under all this water hyacinth. Native plants like hippo grass also became much more abundant, and there are now these large islands of floating sood on Lake Victoria, which before was relatively open. This is the mouth of the Nyando River. Here's Kisumu, and you can see the enormous amount of soil erosion and nutrient input to the lake. All of this makes a terrific story. And Hubert Sauper, an Austrian filmmaker living in Paris, made a film that I think many of you are probably familiar with that got Hubert into all kinds of trouble as he illustrated through cinema verite the rise of the arms trade, prostitution, AIDS, orphanage, orphans everywhere from AIDS. It's a little bit of a one-sided account, but nothing in it is explicitly untrue. We also got a large grant from NSF to tell the story through public aquariums. This was a look into the exhibit when it was at the New England Aquarium, the institution that got the grant and created the exhibit. And I was proud of the fact that the exhibit told the story not from the standpoint of, forgive me, but Wazungu researchers, but rather from the standpoint of our colleagues who live and work there. In order to better deconstruct what actually was going on in the lake, we created a model, a loop model, actually several dynamic models of the relationship between among ecological components of the system, among socioeconomic components, and the two together. And this was a simple loop model built by Andrea Downing of the University of Wageningen. But we eventually now are creating a fully operational dynamic model of the lake with our current NSF grant. And that's being coded in MINES, which is an ecological economic modeling system. We explored thoroughly the whole region to find out where the missing species of fish had gone. This was back when working in northern Uganda was not such a great idea for anybody, really. So we had to have an armed guard. But this is a piscivore of a sort that disappeared in Lake Victoria. This is a fish that used to rip the scales off other fish that we found surviving, if just barely, in Lake Chioggia. And that was the big surprise. We discovered a huge area of tiny lakes. Well, we didn't discover it, people live there. But we discovered that in these lakes, some had come to resemble the current Lake Victoria, and others were still operating like the ancient Lake Victoria, setting up a phenomenal natural experiment that we have been studying and publishing on for some time now, mostly with the Ugandan Fishery Research Organization, NAFIRI. We also used modern methods, DNA sequencing, stable isotope analysis, to help enrich this story of lakes in the past and the future using our Lake Chioggia time machine. More recently, we've had a grant for the last several years from NSF, the Coupled Human Natural Systems Program, with the University of Denver and an organization called One Earth Future, which has a special program on sustainable fisheries led by my colleague, Sarah Glazer. This is a satellite rendering of patterns of productivity in Lake Victoria, where red is highly productive. And the amazing thing here is that the lake is not homogeneous. If it ever was, it's really heterogeneous now. So in Lake Victoria, we have kind of a mirror of the experiment that we began examining in the Lake Cheoga system. In Emin Pasha down here, the lake is relatively oligotrophic, more like the past. In Weenam Gulf, especially near Kisumu, the lake is incredibly eutrophic, more like the future. So actually what we have the opportunity to do is to contrast the pluses and minuses of these two situations and then decide on a target for management to move the lake toward taking into account that dams are being built and climate change is a thing. In our survey of the lake, we discovered that many of the species are adapting to the new system, and some that we thought extinct have resurged. We've been able to find a couple of representatives of almost all of the trophic groups that once existed in that full fauna, still present or resurging in new forms, but exploiting many of the same ways of life that the original fauna did. So the biodiversity of the system is adapting to new conditions. It's much impoverished, but we can tweak the knob one way or another. Now, these fish are the food for Nile perch if you want to make Nile perch grow fast. So actually, the indigenous biodiversity is directly relevant to foreign revenue. So we want to ideally manage human activities in the lake to balance biodiversity and fishery production. Now, as part of this, one new industry that's erupted in the lake is cage aquaculture. And this has developed partly under pressure from overfishing, reducing the number of Nile perch and tilapia of appropriate size for market. Neither of these species is in danger of going extinct, but you can fish them down. It's called growth overfishing, so that they're all too small or too big. So John Okechi, who's right here, looking annoyed because the tilapia grown in this cage farm were sick. And we're trying to help the fish farmers develop better methods, better access to markets. And so a group of us now at BU are writing a proposal with the Celestis Juma Legacy Foundation to bring technology, governance theory, and ecology to bear, along with aquaculture technology, and cell phones, which are the universal mode of communication for markets now. But we want to do all this in a frontier community, Bunyala. Bunyala is located straddling the districts, well, the now counties of Busia and Siaya, and several other of the new counties in Kenya. And it's the home of my dear friend and colleague, Celestis Juma, who passed away 4 years ago. And so we've been having these workshops to develop this project, which we hope we can get funded, marrying microgrid technology, cell phone technology, aquaculture technology, governance, and all of this information we've garnered about the ecology of the lake to try to help make this new source of livelihood and protein viable, sustainable, and part and parcel of an overall conservation program that balances biodiversity, food security, and energy for the future. The work has been an uphill battle. These people, many of them are small operators struggling to get these cage farms going. It requires substantial capital investment. But the beauty of it is that much of this is being conducted on a community level. So the whole community, a series of villages and normally an adjacent town, all are working together. Enclosed in this microcosm are the investors, the banks, the people doing the work, and the whole value chain. And what we're hoping to bring to bear through ChemFree, through the Research Institute on Fisheries in Kenya, is a monitoring and outreach kind of extension service along with fisheries, the Department of Fisheries, so that we can make a successful go of this without further diminishing the ecosystem services flowing from the lake. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop my screen share now. Oh, you did. Okay.
Oh, I think you did, but thank you so much, Les. That was fantastic. There's so much there that you covered, and you made it understandable for those of us who do not have a deep biology background, or at least I felt that way. So now I want to turn it over to a Q&A. If any of you in the audience here would like to ask a question, feel free to submit a question in the Q&A box, or if you click the raise hand button, I can call on you and unmute you so you can pose your question here to us. I guess while people are brainstorming, so Les, I was familiar with cichlids because my brother was a aquarium fan and stuff, and a biologist. So I'm just kind of curious about that dimension. Has that affected the sort of the biodiversity that you've been exploring, or is that sort of a?
What, you mean the aquarium trade?
The aquarium trade, yeah.
In an amazing way. So
okay.
First of all, we worked in several small lakes around Lake Victoria for the reasons that I gave. One of them is Lake Nabagabo on the west side of the lake, of the main lake. And the others are these Chioga lakes. And then we worked in the Fort Portal lakes up in Toro. And first of all, Aquarius wanted us to bring live fish back. So we hooked up with collectors who knew the airplane, how to get them shipped, and the fishery research institutes, of course. And we did several things. First, we raised money to build aquarium facilities in Kenya and Uganda. We wanted to do it. And Tanzania is always lagging behind. I don't know why. I mean, life is wonderful down there and quiet, but sometimes that's a disadvantage. But we did get aquarium facilities that could serve as halfway houses for these fishes headed out of the country, and also as research facilities so that our students could see the fish alive from the side instead of peering down into murky water. Several fish farmers in Florida, including Leif de Mason, a company called Old World Exotics, began to import both through us and on their own. And this became a critical resource for the research on the European and American side, because the collectors would go places we didn't even know about. And then we'd go back and reconstruct and try to find out where they were. A lot of my work was supported by Tetra, the fish food company, by Eheim, the German filter manufacturer, by the Marineland Aquarium Supply Company. I mean, we did okay. And the American Cichlid Association. They've been big supporters both of the fieldwork and the captive breeding program. And now we've started a new adventure. Working with, so University of Florida has an extension service for the aquarium trade. It's located in Ruskin, Florida, near Tampa. And they have experimental fish ponds. Now, for years and years, we've had this captive breeding program, and everyone thought we were going to move the fish back to Africa. And I kept telling him, that's not exactly the point. The point was to learn about the fish so we could set up in situ conservation programs. But we realized after a while, we don't know how to restore dozens of species at once.
Mm.
So right now, we're running an experiment using fish from the captive breeding program from aquariums all over North America. We've shipped the fish to the experimental facility and adapted several ponds to see what happens if you try to naturalize these fish under semi-wild conditions as one species at a time or as multiple species together. Will they maintain their differences? Will they hybridize, which unfortunately they can do? So how do you reconstruct a community? So our University of Florida colleagues are collaborating with us now, and the North American Zoos and Aquariums are collaborating with University of Florida, and we're running this experiment, hopefully the first of many. Now it's of course easier to run it in Florida. It sounds dumb because the work is in Africa, but once we know what we're doing, then we can take this know-how, and instead of going to ponds in Africa, we can try to restore impoundments, reservoirs. We've been invited to do this. We just haven't been ready yet. We may even be able to maintain some of the refugia in the Lake Geauga Basin, which are now gravely endangered, mostly by climate change. Lake Geauga is only 1,000 years that it's been wet. It was a swamp. Obviously, it's wet, dry over millennia. But now these small lakes are being heavily impacted by people building up around their shores. So ultimately, conservation is going to rest on proper management of Lake Victoria and the other large lakes, and the maintenance of these refugium communities in small, what we call satellite lakes. Where ultimately this is all headed, well, I don't know, and it's not my decision. We just want to hold the pieces in suspension before it's too late.
This is great. I think there's just so much you're involved in, which is great to hear about. And I think tying into this, well, all the points you've been making here, but I see that Tim Weiskell, one of our visiting researchers here at the African Studies Center, had a couple questions about interventionist ecology. So let me unmute you, Tim. You should be able to speak now.
Hi, Tim.
Hello, I'm Tim. I work in West Africa, and I'm really fascinated by all your work on these lakes. In fact, it's very, very impressive, but also rather scary.
You're telling me.
Well, I needn't tell you. You're the one who are telling us and the rest of the world. I've been more attentive to the other side of Calestis Juma's work, which was more in the biological working on agriculture and his work with the Rockefeller Foundation and
we need
others.
to talk, by the way. We're supposed to get together at some point.
Yeah, we should do that. The anxiety I have is part of what I had when Calestis was teaching at Tufts and then at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He presented the best face, in a sense, for the biotech approach to African agriculture. And it was very attractive in many respects, but it was very dangerous in other respects, in the sense that, well, according to the law of unintended consequences, you had a kind of wake of anxiety problems in back of or in the passage through of any of the ideas that he was trying to implement.
Yeah.
And it's as with the case of the Green Revolution, it's not so much that people don't intend well, but that they have no real equipment to cope with their own success.
Yeah.
One of the key problems with the Green Revolution is that it was so successful. And in fact, these new crops, or what were referred to as HYVs, but really were HRVs, that is not high yielding varieties, but high responding varieties,
Right.
they responded to the whole package that they came with, namely the fertilizers and the pesticides and the irrigated water systems in particular. And in effect, more and more hypercoherent ecosystems were being introduced to produce momentary surges in output in terms of the particular species embraced and involved and then promoted by governments and foundations. And the result was that a lot of indigenous species were displaced.
That's right.
Completely. And one of the biggest and most devastating indictments against the Green Revolution is that it was the victim of its own success. It displaced more indigenous and endogenous populations of biota than it could possibly replace. And it was those indigenous systems that were required for long-term stability, not the
Right.
petro-intensive introductions. I would get into debates with Calestis over at the Kennedy School on this issue. And he would argue, as the Rockefeller people did for years, that they were trying to increase production, which is true. I mean, it's very laudable and important goal. At the same time, they were creating more and more hypercoherent and therefore vulnerable systems in their wake. And that tension never was really worked out, but it is actually quite visible in the current debates that are going on, especially over Tufts, between the food people and the appropriateness of the quote unquote green revolution for Africa, or as some of them put it, Tim Wise in particular, the total collapse or failure, is the word he uses, of the green revolution in Africa. Now, the Kennedy School was still wedded to the notion that the green revolution was an absolute paradigm example of the great success of technology applied to, well, no, they still are. They still go around embracing it. People like Joe Nye, who've never been an agriculturalist in their life, sort of embrace the notion because of its productivity, quote unquote. That is, its mass. It wasn't productivity they were looking at. They were looking at production, not productivity. There's productivity is always a ratio of something to something else. In other words, you have energy productivity, water productivity, topsoil productivity, whatever. But they were actually just measuring amounts. So they're looking at production levels rather than ratios. And the result is they kept being mesmerized by the success of the green revolution, you know, that the total volume increases, and not looking towards the stability or long-term impacts. And this is why I was very interested to see that you're working with the Center for the Study of Long-Term Consequences, as it were, over at BU, with Adon Ajam, who's a good friend of mine and taught in my course on climate change for years, because it's that necessity to keep the long term in perspective that's absolutely crucial in coming to any kind of assessment of the green revolution or other, what might be called interventionist ecology in one sort of another. And that's what I'd like you to reflect on with us a bit here, because I think you're way ahead of the scientific knowledge that those of us in the social sciences and history do not have. On the other hand, those of us in social sciences and history are systemically nervous about things like dams and that displace large amounts of people and are embraced by governments for electricity and things like this. And who sense that there's something ecologically disturbing going on here, but we haven't even been able to get close enough to the lakes in order to get permission to look at it. In other words, they're such nationalist projects that you're not given a permission to go study anything about it because it's a state secret, either in the Ivory Coast or in Ghana with the Volta Dam or the Kokumbo Dam in the Ivory Coast. These are largely generated for, one must say, the primary benefit of the engineering companies that build them.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And that's the point.
Yeah, exactly. And that's been the point of a lot of foreign aid infrastructural projects, you see, that are basically supposed to enhance local agricultural development or introduce new miracle varieties. Well, the miracle is you plant the variety and the profits get sucked out of the country.
Tim, if I may, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make sure we have two other questions here. I just want to make sure we have time for them.
Well, just
Celeste, if you want to respond briefly.
Yeah, just briefly, Tim. I'm down with everything you're saying. Calestis and I argued about this a lot because Calestis would tend to dismiss the darker side of it, which was ironic. Calestis was the first secretary of the Conference on Biodiversity. I mean,
right.
And go like, Jesus Christ,
very...
what are you talking about?
Exactly.
So the purpose of my research team is to provide a longer look so that we don't make decisions that come to bite us in the ass down the road. And I mean, not everybody listens, Tim. I don't know what we need to talk about this.
Okay, we will.
All right, thank you, Tim. So let me move to the next question here from Ethan. Ethan Keyes, one of our PhD candidates here in history. So he's somewhat familiar. He's saying, I'm somewhat familiar with the Gibe River system, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Actually, I think you said Gibe before.
I tried both because I'm not sure which.
Okay, well, I apologize for those who know. So he's approaching it from a different historical perspective. So this is something interesting for him. It seems like a lot of this talk relates to major interventions through dams and the Nile perch introduction into water systems and what those repercussions are. Are your expectations that the effects of the river dams anticipate issues that will be encountered in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt with the GERD project? I think you referenced what's going on at Lake Tana, but that might require an entire other talk to get into.
Right. So the Renaissance Dam is going to have equally profound impacts, but somewhat different. They're going to, I mean, it's basically cutting off mainstream flow of everything. Upstream migration of fish. It's going to reduce the pulse flow. It's going to reduce productivity. But I mean, you don't have to go that far into deep ecology here. I mean, it's going to screw up a lot of people immediately. I mean, that's kind of like number one. But we don't need another demonstration of the downside of dams. I mean, there are endless numbers of reports and studies. It's what Tim said. These are dam projects are basically graft. I mean, you build dams for electricity, for rural electrification, but you don't have a rural grid, and you sell the electricity to some other countries' cities. So way too long to get into, but yeah, the Renaissance Dam is going to be like, they're going to be like bookends, Renaissance and the Gibe cataracts. They're both going to be devastating, largely because of the amplification of the downside by climate change.
And then one last question here from Zach Gersten. He's one of our graduates from BU.
Zach and I are good friends.
Yeah, you know Zach. Okay. So hi, Les. You framed fish as an important source of protein. Do you have a sense of how much protein intake, total or animal, is attributable to consumption of these fish? Also, is there research attention to fish for supporting micronutrient intake, such as iron?
Excellent question. So it used to be, Zach, as you know, I mean, you were either a fish person or a not fish person, according to your people, your tribe. That, as I mentioned, that's been much more kind of homogenized now. And I don't know the actual percents, but many more people are now dependent on fish because cheap fish are available. In Lake Victoria, I can't even afford Nile perch anymore. Not on my NSF budget. But I can afford omena, the little minnow, which we put into scrambled eggs and stuff. So as long as there is some cheap fish available, fish will constitute larger and larger proportions of the protein requirement, especially since the price of beef has gone up even faster. Chicken is kind of a middle ground. And as we micro chicken cultivation and maximize the yield through better feeds, I think we can even take some of the pressure off the fish. But as far as the micronutrients go, this has not been as much of an issue in East Africa as in Cambodia and in the Mekong, where micronutrients from certain fish from the Tonle Sap, the other most productive lake in the world after Lake Victoria, those micronutrients are absolutely essential. And as the fish supply has waned, there's an NGO that's giving people, the micronutrient that's most important there is iron. And they're giving people little goldfish made out of iron that you put in your soup pot. And they're trying to substitute for the iron that way, instead of getting it from a little eel that we used to eat from the Tonle Sap. So yeah, micronutrients are a major issue, along with protein. And fish provide micronutrients you do not get from chicken or beef.
Well, wonderful. Les, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to finally meet you, actually, but also just to hear so much about what you've been up to. Thank you all for joining us.
Also, Eric, we should strong arm Jim McCann into speaking again on Tana.
Okay.
I think you have some new info. Jim and I are hoping to work together there, but we're still waiting to hear about funding.
Okay, well, sounds great. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your short week, and we'll catch you soon.
Take care, everybody. And Tim, I'll catch up with you.